Um, you went into college as a journalism major, right?
I did.
In Missouri.
Yep.
And so when did you know that that's what you wanted to do? That's what you wanted to pursue?
That's a great question. I don't know if I ever really knew immediately. I went to the University of Missouri in sort of a strange way on a caddying scholarship of all things. The people that gave that scholarship, I was a golf caddy, so I got a scholarship for that, believe it or not. There's something called the Evans Scholarship. It dates back to the early 1900s. And because they knew that I was interested in journalism, they said, we'll give you the scholarship, but you got to go to the University of Missouri, because they knew that was arguably the best journalism school in the country. So I went there and just kind of started out putting my sort of toe in the water and trying to figure out if I like this by working at the school newspaper. And actually, back then I was really into sports reporting. And I went to the main newspaper and they said, sure, we'd love to have you on the staff, we'll make you a reporter. And they had me covering like women's volleyball and women's track, which I really didn't like, and thought, this isn't any fun. And there was a smaller newspaper that also, printed, but nobody worked there. Nobody read it really, but they had press credentials. And if I went and worked for them, I could cover football, basketball, the things that you're interested in sports. So I went to that paper and started working there and got press passes to the football games, basketball games, and wrote about those teams, which I really liked. And so that just kind of evolved into thinking, well, I like this, what's next? And then I started working for the college radio station. I enjoyed that. Worked there for a while, and after a little bit there, you find out there's a college television station. And now it was, well, let's try that. So it was just kind of a progression of different things, writing for the paper, doing stuff for the radio, and then television, all sort of different types of broadcasting.
And now you mainly focus on the feature writing and the feature reporting. I know you've done sports in the past too, while you've been in town. But what I'm really interested in is this caddying scholarship.
Oh.
Looking back, do you think that while you were caddying, I've read that you were, quote, a hard-working caddy, and that's why they wanted to give you the scholarship. Do you think that helped you, like your interaction with different people all the time? Do you think that kind of helped you develop like an interview style, a conversational interview?
Probably not, believe it or not, because as a caddy, you were kind of not really told, but the smart thing to do was be quiet. Don't talk unless they talk to you. I mean, these were country club guys. So, once in a while you'd have a guy who was chatty and liked to talk to you, but no, I developed absolutely no interviewing style from my days as a golf caddy. In fact, in high school, because I worked for the high school paper too, again writing sports, and you remind me of thinking about interviewing people. I'd have to call up the hockey coach and the football coach on the phone, and it was frightening to me to have to call them up and tell them, I'm with the school paper, can I ask you some questions about the game? And I despised that part of the job. I wasn't comfortable at all doing it. I thought, why would they want to talk to me? And as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, the last thing I wanted to do was be sort of doing that. So it's kind of interesting when I think about that, 30 years later, and now I'll talk to anybody. And
I was going to say, did your comfort level come with just maturity, or just doing it over and over again?
I think just doing it over and over again, probably, and probably even more so when I started doing features. When I was doing regular news, and I did that for years before ever coming to Nashville, I don't know. I always kind of felt like I was bothering people to a degree, which I think to some extent you have to do to be a reporter. You do have to bother people, because there's people that deserve to be bothered, and there's other people that don't. So I was always uncomfortable sort of having to bother people that I didn't really feel needed to be bothered. So that's probably why I wasn't a great hard news reporter.
Upon graduating from Missouri, did you stay in town and work for those same papers, or did you move on right after that?
No, I moved on pretty quickly. I graduated in May, and in September, I got my first job. And it seemed like the longest time between May and September, because I wanted a job immediately. I look back at it now and I kind of think, what was your hurry? You know, you should have enjoyed your time there for a little bit. But all my friends were getting jobs. I wasn't getting jobs. All I was getting was rejections from television stations, you know, small television stations all across the country. You know, you name a city, I could tell you, yeah, they didn't want to hire me. They didn't want to hire me. And so my first job in September was in Amarillo, Texas. And I had to get a map out to figure out where Amarillo, Texas was. And hopped in my car and put everything that I had in the car and drove to Amarillo, and that was my first job.
Okay, well, I have one story in particular from your Amarillo days that I'm interested in. Talk about the pig farmer that lost his pigs, and you did a story on that. Can you just?
Yep, that was actually my second job. That was Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and there are.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah, that was Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That was my second job, and a lot of pigs in Iowa. And it was, from what I've understood, and Alan Griggs could probably tell you better than I could, but here in Nashville, I sent a tape trying to move up from Cedar Rapids. You know, you're kind of always trying to progress and move up. And I sent him a tape, and that was one of the stories on the tape. I was a serious reporter back then, but I just kind of threw that one on the tape. I mean, I was doing lead stories and real news, I guess, in Iowa. And for some reason here in Nashville, they loved that story. And I think it sort of, the light bulb went off for the management at Channel 4 to say, maybe we could have this guy come here and just do feature stories, which was sort of a shock to me at the time. It was like, what? You want me to do feature stories? So that's what I wound up doing.
And you're still doing that now. How do you go about finding a really offbeat, kind of on a level of strange story that most people would never hear?
Well, you kind of just keep your eyes peeled as much as anything. I'm always looking, always listening. I'll hear something, somebody will say something, and I'm always thinking, I wonder if that could be a story. There could be something more there. I get phone calls, I get emails. Most of the time it's kind of me, though, because I don't know, there's just something in my mind that I can hear or think or see something and look at it maybe in a way that's a little bit different from everybody else. So I think that's maybe just a natural curiosity at times, that you can look at something and some people don't see a story there and other people do.
And have you ever had to, I'm sure you've had to, just forget about doing a particular story just because your assumption might have been wrong?
It's very rare. It's very rare. My attitude usually is, if I'm in the car and we drive to the story, there's a story there. I'm committed. I will find the story. So, again, it's a little bit different with features than, again, real news. And by real news, I mean obviously a fire or a crime or something like that. But I always like to think that if I think there's a story there, chances are there is. And for me, as a feature reporter, the main thing is there video? And by that I mean, are there people doing something? Is something happening? Is something going to be happening? If I have the pictures, I'll figure out what the story is. And that's basically just by asking questions and being curious and, you know, just kind of letting human nature take over.
I found this kind of interesting. I am a huge Walter Cronkite fan, and the way that he got interested in news was working at baseball games growing up. Mm-hmm. And I was reading in your bio, and you worked at Wrigley Field. Have you ever compared the two, or did you?
I didn't know he had that background with baseball at all. Not really. No, I can't say I have. I mean, my connection to CBS, where obviously Walter Cronkite sort of made his name and hay, was just watching the CBS News in the mid-'80s when I was in college. I mean, as much as I learned at the University of Missouri, I contend that I learned more every night at 5:30 watching the CBS Evening News, because they had terrific reporters, great writers, and that always inspired me. I'd see something and I'd just shake my head and say, wow, that is a great way to tell the story, or a great line. And so because of that, I don't know, that really made me think this is something that I'd like to do, and do it as well as they do it.
No, did you have any other maybe news idols?
Oh man, I had a bunch of them, and most of them worked for CBS. I always liked Charles Kuralt. There were a bunch of names that probably wouldn't mean anything to, you know, younger college students today, but you know, some of them are still there. Guys like Anthony Mason, Bob McNamara, Bob Dotson, who's an NBC reporter, still working. Bob Simon, CBS reporter. I mean, they just had a way of not just giving you the facts, but telling them in a way that, you know, just were well written and well done, and you kind of just knew it when you heard it. You'd hear something and you'd think, wow, what a terrific way of getting your point across. And they were always different. They stood out, and I always thought, you know, I don't want to just be like every other reporter. I'd like to try to find a way to tell stories that stand out, that people remember. And, you know, if you can do that, I think you've succeeded.
Do you think that that helped you when you went back to sports, maybe because you had a little bit something different to offer?
Maybe. I was never a big fan necessarily of sports on television and what I was able to do. I mean, I think I was okay at it, but you have such limited time, and you know, you can try to be who you are as a writer, as whatever you want to bring to a sports story, but in the end you got to tell people who won the game. You know, so you can't get too fancy. The bottom line is, well, he did all this cool stuff, but he never said who won, you know. So you're kind of limited there, and I discovered that early on in life as a journalist, that sports was limiting to me, and kind of, you get the idea that everybody sort of says the same thing. The athlete, the coach, it's do or die, there's no tomorrow, we're going to give 100%, one game at a time. And after a while that just got old. And so I found, sort of branching out and just meeting regular people, that it was always different. I never heard the same thing twice, and that kept me interested.
Is that what you like most about feature reporting, is meeting a different person every single story?
I think so. I kind of like the surprises that you get with people, you know. You go into a story thinking one thing, and I used to, when I was younger, you know, it had to be that. That's the story. That's what they told me it was. And so no matter what, that's the story. But as you do it more and more, you just kind of keep your ears open and you listen to what they're saying, and it's like, wait a minute, that's not the story at all. What I thought it was, much more interesting, is what they're telling me now. And so you just have to kind of be willing to let it change. And that's the thing that kind of interests me now, is like, you go and you think it's one thing, and boy, it turns into something else, and you go in a completely different direction.
Now, kind of sort of transitioning back to your days in Nashville, just mainly, you've worked alongside several legendary people in this town, and unfortunately, one of the most legendary just passed away, Bill Hall. Can you talk about your relationship with him, and just, I mean, basically what he meant to, I mean, the news team over at Channel 4 WSMV?
Well, I think Bill had an ability to almost be a friend to everybody who watched him. And that's so uncommon and almost impossible for most people. He didn't try to do anything fancy. He didn't try to shock people when there was bad weather. He didn't try to use the greatest technology in the world to say that that's what was the reason you watched him. People watched him because they liked him and that they trusted him. And I think he just had that ability to naturally be himself on television, which is a hard thing for a lot of people to do. You know, everybody kind of tells you as you go through journalism school what you need to be somebody that, you know, can present the news or the weather on television. And I don't know what Bill's background was as far as that, but he sort of had it. And he was the guy you wanted to be around to just watch. Because in most places you'd look at him and you'd think, really, this is the weather guy? Because he wasn't like anybody else. And maybe it was because of that that made him so popular and so liked by, you know, all of Middle Tennessee.
And he had a show on, I guess was it Sundays? The Tennessee
Sunday
Wild
nights.
Side? And you did work with that as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he did basically a hunting and fishing show, and that was Bill, you know, and I think that helped him relate to so many Tennesseans who are into the outdoors and hunting and fishing, and that was Bill. You know, he was just a regular guy who went out, hunted on the weekends, fished, and people could relate to that, and his attitude on those stories was just let it happen. Put a mic on Bill, and whatever happened, happened, and it was just natural.
And you did feature stories for that show too, as far as, yeah, I was reading one that was a guy that made duck calls, a guy that maybe Bill went out fishing with, and you did features on those people too, right?
I would do feature stories for that, and also for a program called Tennessee's Wild Side.
Mm-hmm.
I did more for those. But yeah, just features on anything related to the outdoors and duck calls and turkey calls and all that kind of stuff. Usually I would always wind up doing the stories that weren't really necessarily hardcore hunting stories where people were out there shooting animals, but it was more sort of the backstory, you know, of people maybe making things or singers who sang songs about, and sometimes they would blend those into Bill's show.
Perfect segue. I was going to ask you about your love for music, and I read that you're a big music fan. Can you talk about maybe personally what you like to listen to?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Chicago, south side of Chicago, and the last thing we listened to in Chicago was country music. So a Chicagoan in Nashville surrounded by country music at first for me was like, ugh. But I'm a huge country music fan now. Not so much the new stuff, but the old stuff. You know, I really love old country music, and I think that's because at Channel 4, when I first got here in the early 90s, I'd go out onto the back roads, and there'd always be somebody with a guitar singing songs, and they'd always be singing these songs that I maybe didn't know that were songs written from the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and I just loved them, and that turned me into a fan of sort of that old country music, you know. Hank Williams, Hank Snow, Ernest Tubb, all that good stuff that, you know, a lot of people say is twangy and they don't like, but I loved it. So that and just a bunch of contemporary, sort of more alternative kind of rootsy country bass songs that I still like. And, you know, you find it around here all the time because this is Music City. And the beauty of my job here is, you know, I can do a lot of stories that are music related and sort of justify it by saying, hey, it's Music City. This is the name of our town. We can do music stories, which I probably wouldn't be able to do as much if, you know, I was in Lincoln, Nebraska or something.
Now, I know you said that you really enjoy meeting different people, everyday, ordinary people, but you've also interviewed a slew of celebrities as well. Sticking to the music part, is there any story in particular that sticks out where you've kind of discovered or pulled something out of a famous musician from around town?
I can't think of any offhand, but when you said discovered, I thought of one. I did a story on a 14-year-old girl once at Hendersonville High School who, you know, was just a kid with a guitar, and I had heard that she was pretty good, and I said, okay, I'll go. And so we did a story on her, and she kind of had, her teeth weren't perfect, but she could sing, and she said she wrote her own songs, and you know, we did the story, and her name was Taylor Swift. And at that time, nobody had ever heard of her. We went back maybe a year later and kind of did a follow-up because she got a modeling job with Abercrombie and Fitch, and we thought, okay, that's something different. And she was, I've looked back on the story, and when she was 15, she was singing that song, Teardrops on My Guitar. So I knew then, it's like, wow, she wrote that song back when she was 14 or 15 years old. So, and that was the first time she'd been on television. So that was memorable, certainly.
Absolutely. So can we credit you with discovering Taylor?
I don't think you can credit me, but I know that that story was shown to other people that maybe got her on, I think, Good Morning America later on something, and so it just sort of snowballed from what I did, but you know.
In your bio, it also said that you've interviewed presidents. Can you talk about that? Because, I mean, I don't know how I would go about interviewing a former or current president, so just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know how you go about it either, because kind of when you talk to a president, no matter what you ask them, you're probably going to get the same answer that they're going to give whoever the reporter is. They kind of go into sort of a rote mode of answering questions, which is kind of typical of politicians, you know. Probably one reason I don't do a lot of stories with politicians, because you kind of know what you're going to get. If I do a story with a politician, it'll be something completely different. I did a story on a judge here, Judge Rubens, who passed away recently, who had a Mickey Mouse collection. You know, that to me is more interesting than, you know, his work for the appellate court or whatever. So, and talking to other presidents, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, you know, it was fine, it was fun, it was something to put on a resume, but as far as memorable for me, I'd rather, you know, talk to a hog farmer.
And is that, you've been at Channel 4 since you got here, right? Mm-hmm. And that's pretty rare from what I understand. I mean, that's over 20 years being at the same station in the same town. Talk about maybe what's kept you there, and I guess is, you know, kept you grounded. And
well, I think what's kept me there is the opportunity to just kind of do the stories that I do, which are, you know, completely feature stories, which is kind of a sort of a dying breed across the country. And I've had opportunities to go other places, but not really opportunity to do what I do here. You know, I could go somewhere else and cover murders and to a bigger city and make more money, and it's not what I want to do. I mean, I figured that out 20 years ago. I don't want to go home at night and figured all I did all day long was bother people. And that's what you have to do to be a good reporter. You got to bother people. You got to knock on doors when, you know, you don't want to knock on doors, and talk to people that just had bad things happen to them. And as a feature reporter, I'm always invited. People are happy to see me. I like that, you know. I don't need twice as much money, yet go home every night and think, man, I can't believe what I did today. And sometimes, I mean, some people are built to do that, and that's great, because I think it needs to be done. There are stories out there that need to be told. But there are better people to do that than me.
And you can talk about this as much as you want. Can you talk about a few years ago when you got sick, and how that maybe had changed your career, affected it in some way? And
sure.
I'll just let you take that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I had a brain tumor, which resulted in surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, and you know, I had done stories on people who had gone through similar things or had similar problems or issues in their life, and you know, my attitude then was sort of, you know, you always hear people say, why me? And my attitude was more, why not me? Because I knew all of these other people that had gone through things like this, and I was always amazed at how they were able to go through it and get through it and move on. And you know, it gives you empathy as much as anything. You understand that everybody has something that they're probably dealing with or going through, whether it's illness or family stuff. And I don't know, it's just made me look at people differently, I think. You know, sometimes you're driving on the street and there's a red light and somebody crosses the street and they're walking slowly and they have maybe a cane or something, and you know, you used to think, you know, get out of the way, I gotta go, I gotta go. And now you're like, I wonder what he's dealing with, you know, what's making him limp or what's making him move slowly. And I don't know, it just kind of opens your eyes to the world and meeting people and talking to people and listening to their stories. So it was as much that as anything that that experience gave me.
Um, I had a question, and then you started talking about the person crossing the road, and totally left me. Let's go to you still have a certain love for sports. Do you see yourself maybe mainly focusing on the feature side of sports, and like right now you have Bulger's Beat, and is that the same thing that the morning segment is called as well?
It is.
Okay.
We just call the morning segment Breakfast with Bulger.
Breakfast
Same story.
with Bulger. Now, is that something that that you still do? Do you still want to get the feature side of sports, maybe without saying who won and lost?
No, the feature side of sports is great. Yeah, I don't mind that. And I kind of like covering games and things. I always thought that was kind of interesting to put your own maybe perspective on the game itself. Yeah, again, I like the backstory behind the player, you know. Otherwise, you got 40 sports reporters all saying the same thing. You know, the Titans play, and it's ultimately, you know, the quarterback threw a pass, the guy caught it and scored a touchdown. I mean, there's not too many different ways of saying that and telling that, and that's what you have to do. That's the job. So I still like sports. I enjoy sports, and you know, but it wouldn't be something that I would want to do full time, ever.
You also in your WSMV bio talked about you interviewed Michael Jordan. Was that just a normal interview, or would you characterize it as something else, or?
Well, for two years in a row, when Michael Jordan decided that he wanted to play baseball, we went from Nashville down to, I think it was Orlando or Sarasota. It was Sarasota, Florida, where he was at training camp, getting ready to come. And the only reason we went was Nashville had a AAA team. And actually, for a year or two, I think just 1 year, they also had a AA team here, but AA baseball, AAA. So it was pretty well believed that he would go then to the AA team or the AAA team in Nashville. So that was the connection that made us want to go. And so we got there, we were going to be there for 2 days. And the whole point of the story was talk to Michael Jordan, figure out, you know, what he thinks of Nashville, anything that I could get out of him that made it look like, one, we were there, and he was talking about Nashville. So we got there the first day, and they told us, you know, his sort of marketing communications, PR people said, yeah, Michael's not doing interviews today. So I'm thinking, oh, great. You know, they've sent us down here from Nashville, and I'm going to come back with a Michael Jordan story and no interview with Michael Jordan. So he was at his locker, and I kind of politely went up to him and said, hey, Michael, we're from Nashville. We really would love to get an interview with you. Is there any way we could do something? And he kind of, you know, looked at me very nicely and said, well, you know, I'm not doing interviews today. What time are you leaving tomorrow? And I can't remember, 2 in the afternoon or something. And he said, I'll talk to you before you leave. And I thought, well, I hope he remembers. Next day, went to his locker and he was there. I said, hey, Michael. He remembered and gave us a great little interview. Talked about Nashville. I asked him about country music, you know, just trying to get something where he would talk Nashville so that, you know, people watching would think, okay, he at least knows about our city, wants to maybe be here, is looking forward to it. There was a golf course that he knew about here that he'd already become a member of, planning to be here as well. So he was terrific to me, remembered that I really needed that interview, and made my life a lot easier so that when I went back to Nashville, we actually had Michael Jordan talking about Nashville.
That's pretty, I don't know, not that I've ever known anybody that's dealt with Michael, but it's good to know that somebody can remember you and kind of stay true to what they say.
Yeah, he was good.
Talk about maybe, I know you've done so many, but talk about maybe one of the more interesting, strange stories that you've done maybe over the past just few years.
Man, that is one of those great questions that I never have a good answer for.
Yeah.
Because I think of so many at the same time that I can never just remember one. You know, it's just the stories that I always like are the stories that people don't expect. I mean, I've done a lot of great stories on just people. I love a story that we did on the town of Dull, Tennessee, D-U-L-L. you know, what's it like to live in a town named Dull? Is it dull here, you know? And you could have so much fun with that word and the people of that town if they're sort of willing, and in a way they don't even have to play along. They just have to be who they are, and sort of with a creative look at it, you can turn that into a really interesting story. That was a favorite. I mean, there's so many other people that I've met along the way. A fellow who sat on his porch with a leopard skin cap, older African American, who would carve and create little trinkets out of old red cedar wood. His name was Alvin Jarrett. He lived in Rockvale, Tennessee, which is just outside of Murfreesboro. And you know, you never know what you're going to get when you ask people questions. And I remember asking him, why red cedar? And he said, because that's what the slaves' homes were built out of. And those were my ancestors. And when I'm working with red cedar, I'm thinking about them.
How do you hear about a story like that? I know you say you get calls and emails and just you listen, but I mean, how do you hear about...
All I knew about him was he created things. He was a wood carver. And all the other stuff you find out when you're there. You just find out by talking to people. And I contend that I never do interviews. I don't interview people because that interview to me is a word that it's just too strong. It scares people, it intimidates people. We're just talking here. And sometimes the photographer that I work with will say, are we going to do the interview now? And I'll say, no, we're not doing an interview. And it's almost like I want the person to hear it too. We're not doing an interview, we're just talking. Because when you just talk to people, they'll be themselves. When you interview people, they get scared, and I don't want that.
This may be on a somewhat personal
Sure.
level for me, but I am from Waverly, Tennessee, and you did a story. I don't think it was more than 2 years ago. It couldn't have been about a guy named John L.
Yeah, it was just maybe 6-7 months ago.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't very long, and. First off, everyone in town thought it was great, and there's no telling how many people I saw link it on Facebook because, I mean, we know about John, but we never really expect anyone else to. So I just want to say that was really cool how you did that story. And I was going to say, with stories like that one, I mean, you can't really understand what he's saying at all. Do you come into contact with that a lot?
Not a lot. And typically, you know, it's really hard to do a story when the subject of the story speaks in a way that nobody can understand. And he had some sort of autism that prevented him from really being able to speak. But that didn't stop us from doing the story because it was so interesting. I mean, he was a guy in Waverly who for years would just walk around town with no real purpose, except maybe he'd see people and talk to them, and it was never really clear if he understood what they were saying or they understood what he was saying. Yet he did it every day and still does. And so how do you tell that story? And you know, you tell it through the people that he comes into contact with. And he had a huge impact on so many people in Waverly that to me it was still a great story. You know, you have to sort of figure out how can you be the voice of this person who can't speak? And you can kind of do it by letting other people be his voice. And, you know, I think that works. So you just have to be creative and come up with different ways. You can't let that stop you. I did a story a couple years ago on a stutterers convention in Nashville. Everybody who came to the convention stuttered. Now, typically, television people would say, we can't do a story about that. I mean, but, you know, and I didn't do it in a way, you know, like Comedy Central might, and I don't know if they would or not, but I didn't try to be funny with it. It was a serious story. And, you know, I think it made people maybe think twice about that aspect of life. So there are ways to do stories. You can't always think, I can't do it.
Before we sort of start to wrap up, you've given so much good advice already, but is there a couple, one or two certain things that you think maybe aspiring journalists that are trying to make their way, break into the business, do you think there's something that they, you know, there's a few things that they must know before trying to do it?
I think more than what you should know is just do things, do everything, you know, try different things. If it's new media that you like, get into that, get into television, try, you know, radio. I mean, I guess newspaper, yeah, you know, newspaper still exists, but in obviously different ways. You know, just do things, try it, see if you like it before you maybe completely commit to it and get in a car and drive to Amarillo like I did. I think you can figure it out pretty quickly if you like it or not, and if you really think you like it, do it. If you don't think you like it, don't do it. You're just wasting your time. You know, when you're young, when you're 21, 22 years old, you know, there's so many things that you can do, but if it's something that you like, do it. Otherwise, my advice would be, I don't know, I don't think I have any other advice than that. If you like it, do it.
I can't believe I skipped over this. You obviously, you went to college on a caddying scholarship. Mm-hmm. You have to have a certain love for golf at that point.
Yeah.
Just talk about that. I mean, it's been called the gentleman's game.
Yeah.
I've never been able to get into it. I would get a little frustrated, but
well, at the time I started caddying, I more had a love for money, and that's what it was. I wasn't a golfer when I started. I thought golf was stupid, you know. But that was a long time ago. Nobody golfed back then, except like rich people. But I lived kind of close to a country club. I could ride my bike over there, so I just liked getting paid and making money when I was like, you know, 15 years old. And after a while, when I got around the game, I sort of figured it out and loved it. And I don't know, I think in a way you asked me before, was I able to interview people while I was caddying? I wasn't, but I got to watch people, and maybe that interested me too. You know, golf's a really good game to figure out who people are and what they are. You kind of can't hide who you are on a golf course. You hit a bad shot, you're going to show who you are. Are you calm? Are you, you know, can you deal with it and move on to the next shot, or do you go crazy? I remember golfers that hit a bad shot. These were like men who, when I was 15, I don't know how old they were, probably 45, 50, and they would like scream at themselves. There was a guy named, I won't say his whole name, but his first name was David. He'd hit a bad shot and he'd go, "David, you're terrible." And he wasn't kidding, he was like serious. And I'd look at him and think, you gotta be kidding me. So I don't know, I think that helped me understand people a little and maybe figure people out. But as far as the game of golf goes, yeah, I love it. It's just a fun game and it's a great hobby.
I thought of something else while you were saying that. You talked about watching people, and I don't know if it's just my journalistic nature or just pure curiosity, but every time I'm at a mall waiting to sit down in a restaurant, I'm always either listening somewhat to other people's conversations or making up their own stories in my head, like, who do I think this person is? And you also mentioned earlier that you sort of, you know, keep an eye out, you know, keep your ears, you know, on. And has there ever been a time to where you've just kind of heard something maybe that wasn't like intended for you to hear, and you just, you know, you've just sort of been like, hey, you know, this is a story, and you have to approach that person?
Not that I can think.
That's what I picture in my head when you say.
Yeah,
like
not that I can think of, and it's funny because I don't really consider myself necessarily like a people watcher or anything like that. I'm not like Sherlock Holmes. I'm out everywhere with the, you know, looking around and stuff. It just kind of naturally happens. You know, I'd probably find a lot more stuff if I was more eager. But when I say I keep my eyes open, I kind of just see what's around me. But I can't honestly say that I'm out there exploring and hunting all the time, because it's just not true. You know, I'm, in a way, probably the least organized person who does what I do. I never know what I'm going to be doing tomorrow until maybe late in the afternoon the day before. So I don't know. I just think I'm really lucky a lot of times. Things just happen. And when I get out on a story, I learn things and I think, this is ridiculous. I can't believe this is true. And so, I don't know. I think a lot of it is just dumb, blind curiosity that leads to something more than anything. And, you know, you'll hear things, you're right, I'll hear things, but I can't specifically remember hearing something and, you know, that triggering some great story. But I might just be talking to somebody and they'll mention something and I'll make a sort of a mental note. And if I don't write it down, I'll forget it. So I better write it down too, because I'll get back to the station and it'll be gone.
I know that you said like sports was like very quick and like fast developing, and you kind of had to work really hard, really quick to, and you couldn't really make it your own, make it creative. And as a feature reporter, I know you have a deadline because you have particular times where you're on air. And but can you talk about that, maybe working for that deadline? But it's a little bit different than other news.
Yeah, it's different, completely different. You know, in regular news, something could happen at 3 in the afternoon, and you've got to have it on the air at 4 o'clock. Now, you know, we have a 4 o'clock newscast now, so you don't have as much time. Feature reporting, there is a degree of planning to it. I mean, there was a period where I did 5 feature stories a week, which is mildly ridiculous because, you know, the quality of the story is going to go down the less time you have. I mean, there's no way around that. The more time you have to put a story together, the better the story should be. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be, but it should be better. So I do 3 stories a week now. So you know, that helps because you can be a little pickier. When you're doing 5 stories a week, that means every day you're coming in there with no idea what you're maybe going to do. Find a story, shoot it, write it, edit it, and put it on TV. You know, you can do it, but that doesn't mean they're all going to be great. So you know, but the deadline is always there. Yeah, you can't. The last thing you ever want to do is miss your deadline. So that's always in the back of your mind, even if you're just doing 3 a week, because you know today's Wednesday, and I'm thinking, okay, I know what I'm doing tonight. What's airing Friday?